I appreciate everybody's time today. And as Liz said, I'm going to speak to you today about making your historic buildings more resilient during flood and hurricane events. So I'm just going to get right to it. So the discussion points I'm going to go with, discussing the basics of a hurricane, talking about hurricane data that's specific to North Carolina, factors that affect hurricanes and the resulting damage, look at typical damage from hurricanes, including wind-driven rain and floodwaters to historic structures, cleanup with an emphasis on the retention of historic materials and features, making buildings resilient while retaining historic materials and features, looking at the site, roof, exterior walls, interior finishes, the structure, utilities, and elevating historic buildings. And then I'll discuss the historic rehabilitation tax credits, how they may be able to be utilized during a rehabilitation after storm-inflicted damage, and then ended up showing some other sources you may want to consider. So my colleague Reed Thomas in our Eastern office in Greenville said for years that historic preservation is all about people, and I think that's true. This is Dave Frum, who I met 4 or 5 weeks after his house had more than a foot of water dumped in it from Hurricane Dorian out in Ocracoke. And Dave told me this when I was there. He said, I elevated the house 2 feet when we bought it in 1987, thinking it would last my lifetime. The problem is I lived too long. I find that to be an amazing statement. And along with the theme of this talk, speaks to the resiliency of people as well as the buildings that we're going to talk about today. So let's take a quick look at the basics of a hurricane. A hurricane is a rotating, organized system of clouds and thunderstorms that originate over tropical or subtropical waters that rotate counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere. As the storms move westward, they are fueled by warm water. Hurricanes form between 5 and 30 degrees north latitude, and we've all seen these different names for various stages of a hurricane: tropical disturbance, tropical depression, tropical storm, hurricane, and a major hurricane. Let's look at some data specific to North Carolina. And I think when we look at damage to North Carolina, most people rightfully think of the coastal area as getting hit the hardest, but also the Piedmont, but also the mountains. So there's really no geographic area of North Carolina that has not been harmed at some point in time by hurricanes in the past. You can see some documentary photographs from the floods of 1916 out in the western part of the state, and then documentary photograph from the Masonic Lodge in Fayetteville in 1908. Also, a few quotes from Catherine Beischer's book, The Unpainted Aristocracy, The Beach Cottages of Old Nag's Head, where it talks about how moving these buildings was something that was done historically. This is a report from the National Hurricane Center in Miami, the deadliest, costliest, and most intense U.S. tropical cyclones from 1851 to 2010. It has not been updated since, but it's got a lot of really good information in it. And you can see here that Florida has had more hurricane strikes than any other state, followed by Texas. And then it's either Louisiana or North Carolina. And you can find updated information in North Carolina and Louisiana, either are third or fourth in the number of hurricane strikes. But Louisiana has had more major hurricanes, which is a category 3 or above. There is a hurricane season. We've all heard about it. It starts in June and ends in November. You can see on this table from the report that January to April, we've only had 5 tropical storms and 1 hurricane. May, the numbers pick up. They continue to pick up through September where they peak, and then they start to decrease again going into December. This other table from when they started tracking hurricanes in 1851 has 5 different time periods: 1851 to 2010, 1944 through 2010. 1944 is when they started doing aircraft reconnaissance. Then 1966 was satellite coverage through 2010, 1981 through 2010, and 95 through 2010. You can see that the average number of tropical storms, average number of hurricanes, and major hurricanes increases the further you go down on that list. So the number of hurricanes and the intensity of the hurricanes is picking up. Got some maps that were in that report also. And the red dots are the return periods for hurricanes. And you can see that there's only a few dots, including the North Carolina coast, which is all red dots in the southern tip of Florida, and then going into Louisiana. They also have a similar map for the return period for major hurricanes, which is every 14 to 22 years. And you can see that there's a couple dots in Louisiana, the panhandle of Florida, the southern tip of Florida has many more, and then around Charleston, and then North Carolina yet again. So let's look at some of the factors that affect hurricanes and their resulting damage. Several years ago, I think that meteorologists, they always were talking about the wind speed and what category storm was coming up around the corner. And recently, the meteorologists start talking more about the amount of rainfall in addition to the wind speed. And that's because more people die in floods. But for the purpose of this talk and for our historic buildings that we've got, it's going to be both wind damage and flooding damage. So let's look at wind speed first of all. Again, the category, you can see in the chart, category 1 through 5. Category 1 is 74 to 95 miles an hour, 96 to 110 miles an hour for a category 2, 111 to 130 miles an hour for a category 3, 131 to 155 miles an hour for a category 4, and the category 5 is over 155 miles an hour. Hurricane Andrew in 1992 struck southern Florida with wind speeds of 165 miles an hour. And just a couple of years ago, Hurricane Dorian, when it went over the Bahamas, wind speeds of 185 with gusts of over 220 miles an hour. This chart is from the National Weather Service, and it's pretty interesting. It's got the category of storm going down the left, and then increments, the wind speed in increments increasing in 5 miles. So you can see the first one they have is 75 miles an hour, and the damage is X. And if you increase the wind speed just by 5 miles an hour to 80 miles an hour, the resulting damage is 1.6. And I'm not going to read all this to you. You can come back and take a look at it later. And this is on the National Weather Service website too. So this is pretty interesting information. So you can see that this is not a linear progression, but an exponential progression. And as the wind speeds increase, so does the damage. So you can just go down and take a look at 165 miles an hour, which is what southern Florida faced, and that it's 549 times more potential damage than it is at a wind speed of 75 miles an hour. And then the storm Dorian, when it struck the Bahamas, 185, it's 1,371 times more powerful than a storm coming at 75 miles an hour. Also, you want to look at the storm track, which is your location in relation to the eye of the storm and the direction of the storm. And what they do is they look at the different quadrants, the front right quadrant. Again, remember that these storms are moving counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere. So the front right corner packs the biggest punch. These have the strongest winds, and they're supplemented not only by the speed of the hurricane, but how fast the hurricane is moving too. These areas have the highest storm surge and higher possibility for tornadic activity. When, again, moving counterclockwise, so it's coming against the grain here, the front left corner, the wind speeds are reduced, but you still have strong winds and strong storm surge. And then the bottom left is the weakest, but obviously still a dangerous area. And then bottom right is where the storm regains its strength. Rainfall, obviously a huge effect on what happens. And Hurricane Florence, just in 2018, it was a Category 5 just a couple of days before it hit landfall. And then it dropped to a Category 1 and hit the coast at 110 miles an hour. And rainfall lasted for over 5 days. And the rainfall measured up to 30 inches. I believe Burgal received over 30 inches in Pender County. And you can see that right in the middle, south of Wilmington, those areas received over 30 inches of rain. Also, the size of the storm. I remember when Hurricane Floyd came in, how huge it was. And you can see the eye coming over southeastern North Carolina here, and that this front right quadrant that we talked about, how big it is and how small it is on the backside, coming into South Carolina into northeastern Georgia where you get some rain bands. But you can look how far this comes up. This is going into Canada. Hurricane Floyd was when it hit the coast of North Carolina. And by comparison, how small Hurricane Florence was when it came ashore. Also, the speed of the storm. About the only good thing about Hurricane Floyd was it was somewhat fast. I believe it started dumping rain on my house when it was dark, and at least the next morning when the sun came up, the storm had long since passed. Also, the track of the hurricane. Hurricanes typically lose energy over the mainland, but not over islands or even large peninsulas like southern Florida. And here's the path of Hurricane Andrew. And you can see it's a tropical storm, and then it slowly increases to a Category 1 before it comes up to a Category 5 when it crosses over southern Florida, and did not lose much strength going into the Gulf Coast. But then as soon as it hits the Louisiana coast, how the speeds dropped dramatically. And by the time it gets into Mississippi, it's downgraded to a tropical storm. And again, looking at the route that it took over, Hurricane Dorian took over the Bahamas, and it's a Category 5 when it went over and blasted Great Abaco Island, and then took a dogleg north. Here's the tracks of all the hurricanes, I believe, on the NOAA website. And you can see that many of them stay in the Atlantic, and many of them go into the Gulf. And then for all the hurricanes that we've had, most of them do not hit the mainland of the United States, but plenty of them obviously do. But the further north they go up into the Atlantic Ocean, into the cooler waters, they lose their energy. And most of them just are downgraded to tropical storms. And only a few hurricanes, I believe, have hit the European continent. Look at soil permeability also. I guess the big thing about Hurricane Floyd was about a week beforehand, Hurricane Dennis came up. And you can see it had this strange track coming off the coast of North Carolina. And then it backtracks toward the coast, and then it goes away. And then it comes back toward North Carolina before it goes up into New England. And it dumped 15 plus or 10 plus inches of rain in southern North Carolina. And then a week later, you get Hurricane Floyd tracking slightly further to the west and dumping a boatload of rain, 20 plus inches, right through the Piedmont of North Carolina. And all that water is going toward the ocean, eastward toward the ocean, and already saturated soils. Also, the storm surge. Here's a cross section through the eye of a hurricane and then the eye of a storm surge. And you can see as the hurricane gets closer to land that the winds are pushing the water and creating the storm surge. And then a little bit of it is also pressure driven. And here's some cross sections that relate to high tide and climate change as we start getting sea level rise. You can see that obviously everybody's been talking about increased sea level rise. So cross sections through 2010, 50, and 2100, and the sea level is increasing. So the storm surge is increasing too. So something that we're going to have to deal with sooner than later. Also, the amount of land that's developed. The more development we get, the less impervious surfaces that we get. Any development in the floodplain that you get, and you'll see pinch points frequently being destroyed as waters are trying to navigate their way through. And here's a map showing the damage, riverine damage primarily, going how far into North Carolina it went. You can see coming in around Greenville, Goldsboro, Fayetteville, and then into South Carolina. All this dark blue is all the flooding at riverine areas. Let's take a look at some of the flood maps that have been updated. And this is Ocracoke. So the ocean is off to the east here, the sound to the west. This light green area is a VE zone, which is a high energy zone, so wave action. And then the spit of land here with Ocracoke down toward the bottom. And everything in this light blue is basically a 1% chance of flood. Everything in the yellow is a 0.2% chance of flooding in any given year. Same system, but moving on to Newbern, and you can see again the high velocity area along the Neuse River and along the Trent River, and then coming inland, you have your 1% flood area, and then your 2% in the yellow. Going into Fayetteville, even on the backside of Fayetteville, on the north side, along Cross Creek, is where you get a lot of flooding. And here is downtown Fayetteville, and you can see that you've got the Masonic building over here that I showed you earlier. So let's take a look at that. Is that on the screen? I'm seeing some stuff on the screen.
Yeah, I'm trying to increase the clarity of the text.
Okay, sorry. So we see some typical damage from hurricanes, primarily wind-driven rain and flooding. And what you can get the wind can peel off the roofing material. It can peel off the roof itself, and you can have objects hurled into buildings if the winds are strong enough. And then the wind-driven rain can enter a building through the roof and the walls. Fast-moving floodwaters can dislodge a building from its foundation. Flooding can inundate the living space, undermine foundations, rack the building, damage utilities. Floodwaters can deposit mud and contaminants and damage site features and materials. And here's a few photographs, and I think the interesting one here on the right, this is actually a screenshot from a video from a kayaker in the aftermath of Hurricane Matthew, and he's in Fayetteville. And this is a horizontal mullion for a 6'8" door, I presume. And you can see there's probably 5 feet of water in this building. So here's some cross sections through a wood frame building on the left and a masonry building on the right. So again, your roof shingles, standing seam metal roof, whatever can get peeled off. The whole roof structure can get peeled off. You can get wind-driven rain coming around window and door openings. On your wood-sided buildings, any vertical seams that are not caulked, you can get wind-driven rain in there. And then if you get water in your wall cavities, insulation can get wet, sheetrock and all that. And even on masonry buildings, wind-driven rain, you can get a lot of water pouring through a building, depending if the masonry is underfired, if it's a soft lime brick, soft lime mortar. Everybody's seen wind-driven damage with trees, and that's what you seem to see a lot of. But also, tree roots can uplift various items, such as tombstones, and we've seen even graves and floodwaters get uplifted. Standing seam metal roof at the New Hanover County Courthouse was removed during Florence, as was the standing seam metal roof at the Bellamy Mansion just over the cupola. And even built-in gutters on the right can be a source of water intrusion into buildings. I know of 2 historic buildings that lost their chimney during Florence, and this is the William Smith House at Aversboro Battlefield. And you can also get water intrusion through roof penetrations, chimney, if it's not flashed properly on the right, and if it's not capped. You need to be worried about health concerns. This is what the water looked like in a house where the roof was ripped off on a nice Italianate house from the 1850s. After the roof got ripped off and all this water went through the attic, through the second floor, the first floor, and into the raised basement. So you have to be careful when you're getting into this. Masonry buildings, if the mortar needs to be repointed, that's a source where you can get water intrusion. Hairline cracks, you can get water intrusion. Any spalled brick, you can get water coming in through there. Rising damp in the lower right. If you have a multi-width building, 1 or more courses of brick, and there's not a air cavity in between the wood frame and the masonry, you can get water just being driven into there. And then obviously on top of parapets too, that's an exposed area where you can get water penetration. The Pender County Courthouse, again, Burdell had over 30 inches of rain in 30 hours with these high winds just pelting everything in downtown. And the 1938 courthouse had these tiny little hairline cracks, and it was just enough to allow water to come in. And when it came in, instead of a lime-based plaster, this was a gypsum-based plaster, and you can see how it gets this pillowy effect. So in many locations, in most of the outside walls, it damaged the plaster on the inside too, and it's probably 4 or 5 widths thick. The Alton Lennon Federal Building and U.S. Courthouse in Wilmington, a couple of areas that needed to be repointed. Areas in the upper right where you had limestone and the anchors holding them had corroded with time. And the corroded anchor had spalled the face of the brick. That's an entry point for water. And then many deteriorated lintels over the window and door openings. On a wood frame building, you need to caulk all your vertical joints where your siding abuts your trim. That's a source for water intrusion. And once it gets into that wall, you've got things behind it. You got your wood framing. If it's insulated, bad insulation or whatever, it's going to get wet. If you have sheetrock on there, it's going to get wet, and then you'll get mold growing on there. Your wood floors can buckle when water enters the building, even through wind-driven rain. And then floodwaters, very similar, depending on how high the flood gets. It can come in through your roof. It can come in through your window and door openings. If you have a wood frame building, it's going to come in everywhere. It's going to come in around the siding, underneath the foundation, and through the joist and around the sills. And again, masonry buildings, if the water's up high enough, long enough, it can eventually seep through, especially on buildings with underfired brick and with soft lime-based mortars. You need to look at the utilities. Storm systems can be overrun. Sanitary systems can be overrun. French drains can be overrun. Sanitary lines can backflush if there's no backflow preventer. Basements and crawl spaces can be inundated, and finished floor living spaces can be inundated also. And again, floodwaters, I just have to tell everybody to be careful when you go in there. Every time I see the aftermath of a hurricane and flooding, and there's always people out there playing in the water, there's a lot of stuff that goes in that water. There's bacteria, there's hepatitis A, there's typhoid, paratyphoid, tetanus, chemicals, pesticides. And when I helped friends clean out property in Sampson County a couple of years ago, I got a hepatitis A shot, and my tetanus I made sure was up to date. Entry points again. This is the former U.S. Post Office in Whiteville, and it had a basement. So I would argue that maybe installing a basement in the coastal plain of North Carolina is not the best thing to do. And this was ultimately the building's demise, as it was very costly. And one of the ideas that was floated was just to abandon the basement. Typical floodwater damage. This is that one house in Ocracoke, with the exception of the upper right, but you can see organic mold, fungal growth on the underside of replacement flooring. The finishes on the owner was told to remove the finishes on anything that came in contact, and a lot of good finishes got removed. And we talked about that during my site visit, and we'll speak about that in a little bit also. So let's look at a cleanup with an emphasis on the retention of historic materials and features. Now, when a disaster strikes, it's really easy for me to sit in my office in Raleigh and tell everybody to be calm and step back and assess the situation, but that really is the best advice I can give. You have to be dispassionate and objective and take a look at your situation. You need to plan for the worst and expect the unexpected. This is a property owner who parked his car between the two houses. You can see how tight it is. He didn't want a tree falling on his car. And so what happens is the chimney got knocked down in the high winds of Florence and trashed the top of the car. You need to stop the water intrusion as soon as possible, or even beforehand if you know that you've got a weak point. In the upper left is a log building in Pinehurst, and it was wrapped with plastic. The lower left is a house afterwards in Smithfield, I believe, from Hurricane Floyd 20 plus years ago. And you're not going to be able to, everybody's not going to be able to find a roofer right away. So you may have tarps sitting on top of your building and even on the side of it for months on end until you can get somebody. and a school in Wilmington with a really nice application of a temporary roof here in the right. What we don't want you to do is to go in there and start stripping out everything. And in New Bern, my colleagues took these photographs, Reed Thomas and John Wood, when they were in New Bern after Florence. And you can see that they've got doors in place. You can see that there's a porch removed, and there's a ton of wood all through here. They found mantles out by the road. And we'll talk about how a lot of these materials can be salvaged and retained. And then in the upper right was a house in Wilmington, and they took everything out. And this is up on the second floor. They took the mantle out, they took the baseboards out. I mean, it got wet, but again, we'll talk about how these materials can be cleaned, sanitized, and returned to service. So I guess the best advice for cleanup is if you're overwhelmed, you may want to contact some of those disaster cleanup companies. They got plenty of experience, and they are used to moving around geographic wise. When Florence struck Wilmington a couple of years ago, I spoke to some people from Illinois, and they are all very knowledgeable and doing a really good job in cleaning up. If you do not have power, the best thing you can do is after the storm is go in, open up your windows and doors, and just try and get some air blowing through so that you don't have a stagnant condition. You need to remove the contents of what you've got. If you're going to throw it away, such as maybe some of your textiles, or if you can clean them, you can look at storing them elsewhere. You can pull your furnishings off where they can dry and then be clean later. Remove the water, remove the solids, and don't forget your cavity walls, your exterior walls, your interior walls. If you have moisture coming in from your attic and above, or if you've had flood waters, you're going to have to get into those cavity walls and clean them out too. Rinse down everything, apply a sanitizer, disinfectant, Bariucide on all surfaces and wall cavities. And then we advise you to spray with a Boracare with mold care onto your wood surfaces. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. And then dry the building before you put it back in service. Here's a list of definitions from the EPA on a really nice document, how to safely clean, decontaminate, and reoccupy flood damaged houses, and definitions for cleaning, disinfectant, sanitizer, and sterilizer. So when you've got a building, again, remove the contents so you can get in there and work on the building. Remove your furnishings, carpets, rugs, drop ceilings, vinyl flooring, insulation, non-historic finishes, and flood damage finishes to expedite the drying. And in this photograph here, you can see that the beaded board walls were retained, the door was retained, the door surround, the balustrade, and the staircases, and the wood floor. Mold establishes itself pretty quickly and starts growing, usually within 24 to 48 hours. So you have to be careful. And again, try and circulate air. Again, if you don't have power, open up your windows. As soon as you get power, if you've got nothing else other than box fans, put a box fan in the window and try and draw air going through the house or through the building that you've got. Also, these disaster companies have got dehumidifiers, they've got heaters, and I'm not talking high heat, I'm talking where they'll come in and put like plastic on top of the floor and blow like 80-degree temperature across it and then vent it out the back, and that warmer air is going to pull some of the moisture out, and it's not too hot where it's going to dry things out too quickly. A couple of examples of emergency ventilation systems that we saw after Florence. And usually when you have your paint surface bubbling back like this in the right-hand photograph, it's usually a sign that you've got moisture damage, and that bond with the paint has broken to the substrate. Here's a photograph that Reed sent me, and you can see that this is a really nice way of getting into the wall cavities. It looks like some of the structure is newer back here. You have some more modern 2x4s. And maybe you just had plywood floor. I'm not sure what was here to begin with, but you can see that it's like a sheetrock finish, and they cut the sheetrock. If you had if you had waters to this level, you're going to have to go above that level to make sure you get back to good sheetrock that hasn't been wet. And you can cut it and dry out the wall cavities. And then on the exterior, you can drop your siding to get into that wall cavity. And that may be the preferred solution if you've got like a plaster wall, a line-based plaster wall, which is in really good condition, that you don't want to lose. And here's a close-up photograph of it. Here's a really neat system that I saw, inject the dry floor drying system, but this is meant only for use with clean water damage, such as when your hot water heater breaks. They don't want to draw a bunch of air over and then scatter mold spores throughout the property. But they also have something for drying out wall cavities, and hopefully something along this can be developed for what they call black water, where you have floodwaters going over the finished floor and damaging historic or any property. This is the Boracare that I talked about before, and Boracare with mold care is a really good product. It's a fungicide, a mildewcide, a termiticide, and an insecticide. It's oil-based, so it's going to penetrate into the wood, and it works actually better when the wood is wet. So flood inundated buildings, wind driven rain inundated buildings, when you get into that wall cavity or into the crawl space or into the attic and you've cleaned everything up that you need to clean up, this is just a good last thing to spray on there. And again, fungicide, a mildewcide, termiticide, insecticide. So let's take a look at making properties resilient, and again with an emphasis on retaining historic materials and features. And this is a photograph of Mexico Beach, and you can see the few remaining buildings when most everything is flattened. So this really is not an option for historic buildings, but we're going to show you also how to tie down your structure a little bit better. This is the Bellamy Mansion in Wilmington, and you can see all the air, all the sunlight coming in from the staircase. That's the cupola. That staircase goes to the cupola, and that is the section of the roof that failed. The main roof did not fail, and they had a ton of water. Again, this is in that area where close to 30 inches was dumped in, so they got at least in the upper 20s of rainfall, if not 30 plus inches. And I think they were able to salvage most of the finishes. They may have lost a little bit of plaster and had to redo some varnish coats and all, but I don't think they really lost any historic fabric. What I'm not going to do today is look at various regional and municipal efforts to contain water and protect our downtowns. That's going to be handled on a municipal level, but you can see some examples here very recently in Barron with all the recent flooding, and then the flood wall in Grand Forks, North Dakota. So let's take a look at the site first. And these are not going to help you during a flood event. This is going to help you during the 99.9% of the times when you don't have a flood event. So in the upper left, we'll see photographs, and when we go out, we see downspouts that dump water right at the base of the building. And in older buildings or newer buildings, it's usually not a great idea. You want to pull it away and even temporarily just put these tubes on to get the water away from the building. The house on the right, you can see that the grade slopes toward the house, and then all the water coming off this section of the house dumps right here. So this is a great collection point for water. All that needs to be regraded away from the building. French drain installation, something to consider. This is the Joel Lane Museum house in Raleigh, and you can see this is the house outline here. This is the porch up here, and then the front steps and the sidewalk, and then the sidewalk along the street over here. And this was a real simple, just came in with a couple French drains to either side and to help dry out the foundation. And the foundation was pretty wet here. And then the pipe runs to daylight eventually. This is a house I just looked at the other day. This is a post-World War II house, and you can see it sits pretty close to the grade. And they dug a hole underneath the house when they built the house. So it is lower. This house literally sits above like a bowl that collects water. And already the floor in a couple areas has rotted out. And on the back of this property is probably close to the top of the ridge line. So you don't get a whole lot of surface runoff, and you don't want to do a whole lot in the back with this huge, beautiful tree, but maybe a French drain along the back, and then maybe a French drain along the other sides, or a combination of lowering the grade also. Water is going to find its low point. So if that's under your house, that's where it's collecting. And there is a sump pump, but it's still damp, as you can see. And also here, it's a hip roof, so you're getting water dumped on all four sides of this building. So let's look at the roof. Stainless steel metal roofs, one of the best roofing materials that you can get. I always tell people, if you have a standing seam metal roof, walk on hot coals to keep it, because it's a wonderful roof system. And here you can see somebody did a patch on this roof on what looks to be an original old school, I believe. The stainless steel metal roof is really good because you're not through nailing or screwing down the material through either the flats or through the ridges. And this is actually this section here. This is 3 vertical pieces of metal which are separate. They're all cramped together pretty closely, but this is part of the left U-shaped, really shallow part of the pan, basically this section. And here's your ridge. Here's another pan. So what I'm looking at is this ridge right here. And then you have in the middle these cleats, which are L-shaped. These cleats are nailed historically to the roof decking. And then you butt the 2 pans up to it, you crimp it, and then you give it another crimp. So this is a double lock seam, and it's virtually impenetrable to water if done correctly. And that's the way all of these ridges are done. The ridges are done, and along all the seams are done on the roof here. So the new Hanover County Courthouse that got blown, or the stainless seam roof that was blown off during Florence, when we were talking to the architect, what he decided to do was to improve the installation of the new standing seam roof. So he doubled up on the number of cleats in the lower, like 3 or 4 feet. And then all the cleats, instead of being nailed, were screwed into the roof decking. So that's going to help. That's going to prevent much more uplift than what you had historically. We even did a standing seam roof on this church ruin at St. Philip's, which is a state historic site at Brunswick Town, Fort Anderson in Brunswick County. And they had a lot of root water penetration, despite the fact that there was a cap on this from 1976, I think. And it was a concrete cap, and concrete can get porous, and then it's going to have joints in here also. So you're getting water from above, and then the drip. And I know why they did this. They didn't want to extend it past the face, but the drip is still on top. So you're still getting water in a light rain that's getting where water is just wicking into the top of this cavity. And so what we did is came on top and put a new standing seam roof with a drip edge to kick the water away from the top. And that should help a whole lot. I think 2 years ago, they had to rebuild one of the arches, and they're looking at rebuilding another 2 or 3 of them also as they're having problems. Standing seam metal roofs don't come without, are not problem free. Sometimes you'll get small pitting. You may have some severe corrosion here or there. And there's various ways of addressing those issues, but also the use of elastomeric coating on top of these to extend their life. And again, the Bellamy Mansion in the right-hand section here. This, when Preservation North Carolina, the statewide nonprofit, did this rehabilitation in the early mid-90s, I think a new standing seam roof was going to be several $100,000, and they just didn't have the money. So they put on the elastomeric coating, and it's turned out to be worth every penny and then some. And again, the only section that failed was the cupola roof, and that was because the whole roof failed. But the rest of this roof is still doing pretty good, and they are looking at reapplying that coating, I think, in the next year or 2. And then this is the Poe House, a state-owned museum in Fayetteville, and there was some issues with that roof a couple of years ago, and went in on top of it and applied the elastomeric coating. Built-in gutters, a really nice idea, but sometimes when they fail, boy, they fail spectacularly, and you're going to find problems in your soffits, in your ceiling, possibly in your attic, in your walls, and it could be happening for years before you find out. If you're in a local historic district, you're going to have to talk to the local preservation planner and see what their guidelines or standards say about it. Many of them want you to keep them, but they can be expensive. And it is expensive. Sometimes we refer to people who may not have a whole lot of money, and we just tell you, don't get rid of it, just roof on top of it, and then extend your roof finish, whether it's asphalt, shingles, or metal, just extend that further down. And even asphalt shingle roofs, there's some additional steps you can take when installing that. And here's ice and water shield or peel and stick, whatever you want to call it, being applied to the roof decking. And this is like a bituminous material. And so when you drive a nail through it, it seals around that. So if your roof shingles are peeled off during a storm, you still have this secondary means of protection underneath that. And then here's a photograph of the Pender County Courthouse, which was built in the 30s, and the historic roof was indeed an asphalt shingle roof. And there was some discussion about what to go back with, and they ultimately went back with an asphalt shingle roof as it was the historic material. Let's take a look at exterior walls now. And again, sticking with the Pender County Courthouse, I think I said before, Berg Isle had 30 inches of rain in 30 hours and high winds driving and pelting. And this courthouse took a huge beating. And this is one of the larger cracks, but most of them really were tiny hairline cracks that if you're not looking for it, you're really not going to notice. But after 30 hours of wind-driven rain being pelted into it, the building did suffer quite a lot of damage and a lot of water intrusion. You also have earlier buildings where you have lime-based putties, and lime mortar is going to allow water to migrate, but it's also going to draw that moisture out from the interior of the building to help it evaporate faster too. Portland cement is basically impermeable. Lime-based mortar is really permeable, and it does have some capacity to expand and contract and bridge from brick unit to brick unit. This is St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Wilmington. An engineer called me a couple of years ago about this, and looking at the tower on the left, he said when he opened up the doors, it was pouring on his head. And after talking to him, it appeared that the masonry was covered and parged with Portland cement-based instead of lime-based stucco. And again, Portland does not breathe. So any moisture that was getting in there from rising down through whatever means, condensation, it just took forever for it to get out of the building. And he said the brick was in such poor shape, he could actually do damage with his hands. So talking with him, what we decided to do was to strip the Portland cement, and it was going to trash the face of the brick. It was going to pull the face of the brick off. We knew that, but we told them the workers to be as careful as possible, and then allow the building to dry out. And then allow the masonry to dry out. When the masonry dried out, then they applied a stone strengthener, and then they parged the whole thing with a lime-based stucco. This is the Chilliwack County Courthouse in the upper left-hand corner. This is a National Historic Landmark. And unfortunately, this whole building was sandblasted in the 1970s. And then in 1990, they did a restoration of this. There was a little lean-to on the backside here. The only section of brick that had not been sandblasted were these two walls right here. And they removed the lean-to, and the drawing specifically said, "Do not sandblast." So of course it got pecan shell blasted instead. And so as means to mitigate any effect that the brick would suffer from being sandblasted, they applied a stone strengthener to it. And 31 years later, those brick are still pretty solid and holding their own. This is the Bellamy Mansion, these beautiful, huge piers underneath the portico, and these nice tight butter joints that you get, a lot of spalled brick. In the next year or so, they're going to replace the worst of the brick and then apply a stone strengthener on the rest of the brick. And you can see a lot of this is just under fired brick, and so it's more susceptible to damage. Looking at your window and door openings, wind-driven rain, historically, a lot of houses had blinds on them. So we urge you to go ahead and use your blinds if you got them. Many houses don't have blinds, and it's better to put something up than nothing. Even a storm wind is going to be better than nothing. If you're in a high wind area and you're getting debris thrown against glass, it's obviously going to break it. So, but in the Piedmont and the western part of the state where your wind speeds are going to be decreased, it's something to consider. You're not going to be able to put a storm and a blind in, and the reason is and I'm talking double hung windows here. You can see this section here. This is the lower sash, and then the upper sash fits into this section right here. You've got your blind stop and then you've got your window surround right here. So right in this little notch is where you're going to fit either your storm window or your blind or louver. These are a couple photographs from the forthcoming Edenton design standards. And one of the recommendations is to install synthetic shutters if they didn't have them before on a house where it's appropriate. And then I believe this is Reed's photograph from Key West. And this is a pretty nice idea. This is in the closed position. So when it's open, you're not going to see this. But in the closed position, they attach acrylic, which is really durable. You can throw bricks at it and concrete block, and you're not going to break it. So they affix this to the back side of the blinds, and then they have this bar fixed on the front of that to hold everything in place for when they get high winds coming in. And this is something I've not seen used, and I do want to see used, but hurricane fabric. And this is AstroGuard fabric. And you just insert these pins and then screw down these clamps, and it holds this high tensile strength fabric in place. And here are a couple screenshots. So I apologize for the lack of clarity, but I pulled this off Big Al's Hurricane Fabric website in Florida. And you can see piece of plywood and then hurricane shutters and then the fabric. And then they just very quickly threw a piece of a 2x4, and we've all seen this after hurricanes, 2x4s or some wood sticking out of buildings. So we know that this does happen if the wind speeds get high enough, that a 2x4 can easily go through a piece of plywood, and it can damage metal. But it looks like this fabric, and you can see the imprint from here. I'd like to see how these stock up in the long run. Also, this flood barrier system, I believe they call these flood logs, and this is on the inside of Revolution Mill in Greensboro. And they built these U-shaped channels on either side, and then these panels, which have gaskets, get installed and then clamped down, and everything's held tight. And you're going to have to work with an engineer to make sure that the masonry, depending on how high the water is going to get, that the structure can withstand that much pressure on the outside. And here's a cross section through that, and you can see the channels on here with everything inserted in that. And the vertical flex wall system, and this is on the outside, again, like a high tensile strength fabric on the outside, but also this system, which I'd like to see installed somewhere too, where everything is in the sidewalk out in front of the storefront, including the stanchions that pop up, and then they attach the fabric to that. I'll get to the questions at the end. Sorry, folks. And here's a high flex deploy flood barrier for larger openings. Now, this is something that preservationists aren't too keen about, but applying some type of a material on the exterior of the surface. And it could be something that you roll on there, but it's basically going to be like a water sealer. And you can drive moisture further up the walls and into the interiors of buildings too. So you need to be careful about that. And again, if you're going to do this, coordinate with a structural engineer to make sure that the building has the ability to withstand the forces of water on the outside. And then an option also is just to allow the water to come into the building. And we've seen that a lot in the eastern part of the state. And where after the storm, you just clean everything up and dry it and put it back in service. Obviously, you have some downtime, but it is an option to consider. And probably not an option that's going to be considered as the storms increase in frequency and in intensity also. Don't forget, again, the backflow preventers. So every property should have one of these so that you do not get systems back flushing into your finished space. Caulk your vertical seams between your siding and your trim. And then if you don't have your chimneys kept, do something temporarily if you are getting to keep water coming in from your chimneys. And this is something I did on my house a couple of years ago. I got this from Fine Home Building and changed a few of the entries in here, but I got a couple rooms that are like 14 feet square, and underneath the windows, we had a huge nor'easter, and all the siding, including right in the middle, was wet from both ends. So you need to ask, how do you get your building to dry out when it gets wet, not if it gets wet. So here you can see your studs coming up with your siding on the outside. And I had a bunch of 3/4 square material that I just nailed up into the stud up against the siding. And then I attached a strip or rigid insulation to fit up tight in there so that it was held off of the face of the siding by about 3/4 of an inch. And then the bat insulation. And of course, this is going to be a huge pain, but since it was my own house, I was able to do it because your studs are not 16 inches on center. You're cutting some of them, and they're not going to be all parallel. You might have some that come in at an angle, then you're going to have down bracing also. So, and then your bat insulation that I stuck on top of that, I mean, you don't want to compress that. So you're going to have to peel some of it off on the backside. Again, a huge pain, but if it's up and out of the floodplain, you only have to do it once. Let's take a look at some of the interior finishes. And this is that house in Ocracoke where everything was stripped out of the interior. And I think the owner was told to pull everything out that came in contact with the floodwater. So I'm standing in the 1890s section, and then all the way in the back is the 1960s edition. And the second layer of flooring was pulled out, but the original layer of flooring was retained, and all the beaded board was pulled out. But obviously all the sills and joists were retained and all. And those are easy to access. The house on the right still retains all the beaded board on the stairs and at the in the dado underneath in the wainscot area, but sheetrock above that. So you're going to have to get into this wall, and you might be able to pop off some of the sheetrock and maybe drill some holes in the top of this nailer where the beaded board is attached, and possibly clean it that way and sanitize it and dry it out. And here's the material that was pulled out of that house. When I looked at it, he does have a not trash on the wood floor, but all the beaded board. What I recommended to the homeowner was to keep all of that. Most of it was still straight as an arrow. And if you go out and buy new beaded board, it's not going to be the high quality of board that you get today, and it's going to cost you an arm and a leg to get it too. So I just told him to drive all the nails out and clean it, sanitize it, and then spray it with the BoraCare with mold care. Most of your wood floors, I talked to a lot of companies that do cleanup, and they almost all of them did say your wood floors, if they get in early enough, are going to usually set back down. So when they get wet, they're expanding across the grain, but most of them are going to set back down. And here's a photograph, I think, from Reed in the upper left, showing an example of what somebody was contemplating removing this nice, beautiful, old growth quarter sawn material. And what was going to go back was this flat grain, much inferior. And you can see this is like a 5/4 board, and this is probably like a 3/4 board. So you're losing a 1/2 inch of depth, plus all this beautiful quarter sawn material. Varnish finishes can be restored. Plaster, if it's lime based, can frequently be restored or just cleaned and dried. If the keys are broken, you're going to have some problem. And these are the plaster keys on the backside. You'll see frequently these get broken, and then sometimes you can push on it. So you'll either have to repair it or you'll have to replace it. And then again, the gypsum based, like at the Pender County Courthouse, where it came through the 4 or 5 widths of brick, and then it damaged all the exterior walls. I believe were getting stripped of the plaster. They went in with a moisture barrier, and then Z channels, insulation, and then sheetrock, and then reapplied their baseboard and all. So again, when you get water into that wall cavity, your insulation is going to get wet, your framing members are going to get wet, and if you've got sheetrock, paper wrapped sheetrock, all that's going to be susceptible to getting mold damage. So what you might want to consider is installing like a blue board with a plaster skin coat, or even getting the fiberglass wrapped sheetrock, which is a little more expensive, but is not going to have the mold problems that paper does. Let's look at the structure. And this is a really nice document from Resilient Heritage, protecting your historic home from natural disasters. And I believe this was the Louisiana State Historic Preservation Office, the National Center for Preservation Technology and Training, and the National Park Service. And they've got a lot of really good diagrams. You can see we talked about how your roof structure can get blown off. Nice detail for coming in here on the lower chord of the rafter and tightening everything down to the wall structure, and then tightening your top plate down to your sill plate, and then connecting your sill plate to your masonry piers. Lots of really good details in here. And then this is, if you do nothing else, even just the Simpson strong ties, which have a lot of really nice connections, tying different elements together. And again, the borer care, which I already talked about, wood penetrating, the fungicide and mildew side. So even up in the attic, go ahead and spray it if it got wet. Let's take a look at your utilities. You're going to want to elevate them above the base flood elevation. If you do have utilities in the basement and your basement's at risk, you're going to want to relocate that and install a sump pump. Mechanical systems, if you've got them in the crawl space and it's threatening, you're not elevating the property, take a look at installing it from the attic. If it's a single story, if it's a multi-story building, you may want to look at, you may be able to install or lower your ceiling in some places, and this is not a great idea. It's all going to be dependent on the house. Maybe you can lower the ceiling in like a bathroom and then vent out from the wall. We've seen that. Consider the use of many split systems or the fast systems with the multiple lines, which are just like a couple inches in diameter, and they come out at a higher speed. Consider installing a backup generator. Let's take a look at elevating buildings out of the floodplain too. Our office, we would like to work with you if you have a building listed in the National Register of Historic Places to try to mitigate the effect of elevating the building to ensure that that building can still possess its historic integrity. So if you're in a district, if you're thinking of listing your building, if your building's in a study list district, just call our office. Even if you don't want to list your building, we'd like to advise you and just discuss possible options of how to protect the historic integrity of the building. When we look at it, everything's going to be a case-by-case basis for the building. We're going to look at the size, the form, the massing, style, materials, foundations and underpinning, stairs, porches, and setting. For the parcel, we're going to look at the size, the shape, topography, elevation or the flood risk, and any site features. For the streetscape, we're going to look at maintaining a consistent streetscape with setback, height, and setting. And here's a link to our website at the bottom that shows all these county staff assignments. So if you have one of these, if you have a property you're considering elevating, you can take a look at this and contact the restoration specialist and even the survey specialist, and we can coordinate with you as to how best to do it. Now, just like moving the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse is out of the box, and we're not moving every structure, we're not going to elevate every building also to save it. So we're going to lose a lot of historic buildings. And again, a reminder that buildings have been moved around for a good long while, and as evidenced by Catherine's book here, talking about moving some of these buildings. Let's take a look at the Carolina Industrial School in Pender County, and this is a rural property. I think rural properties are going to be a lot easier to deal with as they have more room and a little more flexibility, as they're not right up on each other. It's sitting in a grid environment and an urban environment. So this is sitting like, I think it's 20 something acres of land, and there's 3 buildings. You have the Dix House, Williams Hall, which is the classroom, and then the chapel. And here are your elevations, your front sides of all these. And this is a real nice approach when you're coming down this road with this little bit of a hill and the chapel sitting on the hill. All of these buildings had about 2 feet of water in them, and the base flood elevation, they want to get it up, and they're looking at elevating these maybe 6 additional feet. So if they're up 2.5 feet and you're going up 6 more feet, these are going to be up like 8.5 feet. This is where I think working with a rural property, there is an advantage. And they worked with architect Clark Hipp in Wilmington, and they got a Covington grant to help them look at doing schematic designs to help mitigate the increase in height of how to mitigate that increase. And here, what I like what Clark did is on the back side of these, he didn't show any of the mitigating factors, but on the front side, he did. So basically, this line right here where it's gray below, all of this is increased height. This is what used to be sticking above the grade line, and now we're increasing it to this elevation. So something you can look at doing is showing more of the foundation. And I think that you had about 2 feet of foundation showing here. So maybe you can go up to about 4.5 feet. It's more than doubling it, but it's one way of dealing with it. And then you can come out about 10 feet, build a short, shallow retaining wall, 18, 24 inches tall. So now you've dealt with like 4.5 feet of it. You can slope between your new foundation and the top of your retaining wall. If you go out 10 feet, slope at 10%, you can gain another foot. If you go out at 5%, you gain another 6 inches. And then you can bring a little fill in on the bottom and slope it away. And since it is the coastal plain, and it's not my money, but you're going to be looking at spreading it shallow, probably like a 5-degree slope or something, so it doesn't look like it's sitting on a mound or what sitting on a mound. And then also making the balustrade simpler. Instead of having the stairs return, just have the stairs come straight down with a simple balustrade. So I think when you look at the front of the school, I think the school is going to be the easiest building to take care of, and I think it'll be all right. I think the chapel is going to be real difficult. Again, it sits pretty close to the grade. You're going up 6 feet. You've got a little stoop out at the front to access the building. Your staircase is going to 6 feet, and you can see here that they put a landing in and turned it. And then you're also going to need handicap accessibility for all these buildings. They are publicly accessible buildings. And how do we mitigate that effect? This one's going to be the most difficult. And figuring out how to hide this run of the handicap ramp. So some real quick sketches. So you can make fun of my little quick sketches if you like, but this is a section through an existing building with the foundation sitting whatever X feet above the grade line, the finished floor, and then assume that your base flood elevation is above your finished floor elevation, which is why we're discussing elevating buildings. As I showed you before, maybe one option is just to show more foundation. And if your building sits pretty close to the grade, maybe that's all you do. If it's only sitting up like a foot and only has to go up 2 feet, it's 3 times as much, but maybe that's all you have to do is just show a higher foundation. You can bring fill underneath the building, fill soil, and then fill soil on the outside and slope it. Again, you want to go shallower, unless you're in the mountains, then you can go at a steeper pitch. You can consider putting in a retaining wall, and then you can slope between your new foundation and the top of the retaining wall. You can look at bringing fill in at the base of the retaining wall. You can look at doing plantings at the retaining wall to hide that retaining wall. You can even consider foundation plantings. Something to consider. A lot of your earlier properties may not have had foundation plantings historically, but if it's going way up in the air, it is a way to mitigate the increased height. And then also a fence. Certainly, most of us are taller than a 3-foot or a 3.5-foot tall fence. So when you're standing right up on the right of way, looking at a building from the front, it's not gonna make a lot of difference. But when you're coming in from an angle, it'll help a little bit. This is one of the few houses that I've had elevated in my region, and this is in Burgal. And this house sat pretty close to the grade. It was about 8 inches up, and they elevated an additional 30 inches. And I think it was quite successful and something that can be duplicated easily. You want to look at what your pier system is. Usually they're going to be brick, and duplicating that if you're creating a new foundation. If you've got underpinning, duplicate your underpinning also, some historic treatments. And what you don't want to do is, and this was an afterthought, all the piers were supposed to be brick, faced with brick. And they built everything out of concrete block, and then the brick was an afterthought, and they came back afterwards. And what you wanted is the brick to be in this plane. So when your skirt board from your house or from your porch overlaps it, it overlaps the top of the brick and not the brick sticking out past that. And here's a couple houses, masonry houses, and some of them better choices than others, but all of them have different, they all got elevated at least a couple of feet, and all the new foundations are different colors. So I guess the thing I would say is look at duplicating, and you can usually find a pretty close match for a brick, or else if it's just going to be concrete block and faced with stucco, look at making that the same color as the brick at least. And you can see this house here. And for this era house, you would typically get like concrete stoops and metal balustrades. So this is fine. But the rest of them are all wood, and I think it calls a little bit of attention to it. And then some of these, you got like small decks out in the front where they wouldn't have had them historically. So just take a look at some of those details. And again, we can help you with that if you need any assistance. In houses that are elevated higher, you don't want to accentuate it even more by putting your garage underneath there. And I know it's dead space and a lot of people want to do it, but you'll see a lot of people, if it has to go up 6 feet, they want to elevate it a couple more feet so they can park underneath. And we do not recommend that. When they go up too tall, I guess the question is, are they still going to retain their historic integrity? And you can see some of them with this addition over here with a really tall 1.5-story section. I don't know if this is parked for an RV or what. And again, here, wood railings, which are fine for these properties. Again, fine, but white underpinning, I believe this is stucco, and I think it calls a little of attention to it. And over here, the gray blends in a little bit better with the white. And right here, the blue color, I think, sort of hides it a little bit. It doesn't cause much attention if it's painted the same color as the body as with this house. And then here, you can see maintaining the streetscape and not pushing it back, I think is really important. So what happens when you go up high is you're going to have a longer run of stairs. So they came down and put a landing and split the stair to either side, which I think, and you can see right here is the sidewalk out in front. So that's going to have to be what it is. And that's a pretty good solution. And I think coming underneath the porch too and not putting underpinning, I think that helped too. So the porch reads still as a porch and an open porch. Again, some of these properties that are not elevated really high, I think easier to deal with. Again, maybe they want to paint the body of the color of the house, or maybe the body of the brick piers, make it all uniform color. And then again, these piers are protruding. Again, wooden railings, nice solution. Over here, this house was raised a fair amount. The body color was repeated down here in the foundation. I think it does a pretty good job. And then these foundation plantings do a lot also. And typically we would not recommend that you come down and flare your staircase wider at the base, but it was done here. And I think on a house that has a lot of decorative sawn work and all, I think it is something that actually was pretty successful here. Here's a house on Ocracoke that got elevated, and a lot of these houses were elevated. When you see these pictures beforehand, a lot of these were filled up with sand, wind-driven sand through the years. And so they were going up, they found historic photographs, and they basically put them up where they were before, or many of them. And another example, may want to do a better job of matching the brick color. And here's where I think a fence helps a whole lot. Again, if you're standing right at the front looking at the house, you're obviously going to see the increased elevation. But when you're walking down the street at an angle, this fence does do something to help conceal some of the increase, the height that you have. And a lot of people want to mark where the old elevation was, grade line, by putting in these little landings here. And I think in a house like this, where it's not way up high in the air, I think it's okay. But where you're elevating a property like 4 feet or 6 feet up, I wouldn't recommend doing that. I think it's going to call more attention having a landing up about 4 or 6 feet up in the air. I would just keep your staircase the width that it was historically and extend your handrail down. This is a property in New Bern, and it went up several feet. So they showed more of the foundation here, but what they also did is they put a small retaining wall out here and brought some fill dirt in behind it. And I think that worked really well in this situation. what you need to be aware of is when you do this, and if everybody in town is doing this, displacing like 12 inches or 18 inches of water in an urban environment, someplace that may not have had flood damage is probably going to get flood damage with all that displaced water. This is a property that we talked about at our branch meeting just last Thursday, and interesting project again in New Bern. And you can see one of the most character defining features of this house is that it sits right up on the right of way. And the road was probably narrower to begin with, and then it just kept getting closer to the house until the sidewalk was right up against it. This house is going up 3.5 feet. The good thing about this property is that this side of the driveway comes with this parcel also. And that's going to come in handy, because what we were thinking of doing was, if you're going up, and it's already up about 3 feet, and it's going up total of 6.5 feet, you're going to have another 7 feet of run for your staircase. So one of the things we considered doing was just putting a landing at the back of the portico, keeping the portico where it is, and then bringing the portico out to where the driveway is, and then attaching your staircase from the landing out here. So it still empties. It's not going to be in the same location. You can just put a balustrade across here to keep people from falling off the edge, and then put a new staircase here, and then run your handicap ramp to the back. This is the Dr. Edith Farnsworth House in Illinois, designed by Mies van der Rohe in 1945 and constructed in 1951. It's owned by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And in 2013, I think they hired Robert Silman Associates to take a look at different alternatives for getting it out of the floodplain. And you can see how this house is inextricably tied to the landscape. Here's the Fox River in the foreground, and it looks like it just hovers above the ground line here, the grade line here, and it's got this patio right here. Patio is about 2.5 feet above the grade, and the house is about 5 feet, even though it doesn't look like it. Here's a site plan with the Fox River. This is where the house sits now. Option A and C move the house temporarily over here. Option B moves the house here permanently. So option A is basically moving the house again temporarily, removing the foundation, installing a new foundation at a higher elevation to get it out of harm's way, and then putting the house back on the site. Option B is moving it out of the floodplain. And again, you can see where the river comes up, these topo lines are close together, and then relatively flat area here in the floodplain. And then where the topo lines get really close together again, and they're moving it out, like we talked about earlier, out of the floodplain area and locating it here. Option C is a really cool idea, where it's going to be stored here temporarily. They're going to remove the foundations and install this new concrete foundation with these series of trusses and then these hydraulic actuators. And the actuators will push up on the trusses. The house will be connected to the trusses, and the house will be lifted. And it's a really neat idea. And it's about as much, I think it costs about as much as elevating the house on its existing site and putting it back where it was. So I'm going to end up talking a little bit about showing you some sources and talking about the historic tax credits. And if you do have a property that is damaged, you need to take a look at possibly fixing it up, either the homeowner or the income producing commercial properties with the income producing tax credits. And here's a link to our website, and I've got it at the source at the end of the presentation too. These little 2-page fact sheets. And there's the income producing is a federal program. If you qualify for that, you automatically qualify for the state piggyback tax credit. And then there's the state homeowners tax credit. So the income producing tax credit, you have to spend, there's a bunch of requirements. The work has to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. You have to spend the adjusted basis, which is the value of the building at a point in time. So it's purchase price minus land value, minus depreciation, plus capital improvements. And your qualified rehab expenditures need to exceed that. So of your qualified rehab expenditures, you can get 20% back as a federal credit. Again, if you qualify for that, you qualify for the state's piggyback tax credit, which is 15% up to 10 million. And then it drops to 10% between 10 and 20 million. And then there's a couple 5% bonuses that you may or may not qualify, depending on what tier county you're in. And then the homeowner tax credit is 15% up to $150,000 or $22,500. The IRS has stated since you are paying for your insurance, if you use insurance proceeds, that's regarded as your money and an eligible expense that you can get a tax credit on. So talk to your accountant, talk to your tax attorney, and do not ask us tax questions. We look at the architecture side of it, but get with somebody who does taxes. But the IRS looks like they have said that is an allowable expense. If you have any problems with your insurance companies, you may want to contact the Department of Insurance. You may want to consider hiring a public adjuster. A public adjuster works for the property owner and not the insurance company. Different sources to consult on our website. We have some disaster preparedness handouts, National Register of Historic Places material, our GIS website. The National Park Service has guidelines on flood adaptation for rehabilitating historic buildings. FEMA has some really good brochures or publications, Clean Flood Buildings, Flooded Buildings, Homeowner's Guide to Retrofitting. And then these, I talked about the Edenton design. They're now design standards instead of design guidelines, but Beaufort and Edenton looked at revising their design standards in the last year and incorporated chapters on disaster preparedness. And Reed, Thomas, John Wood, and I have gone over these with a fine-tooth comb and made a lot of picky comments. I think these are going to be the gold standards when all is said and done. And hopefully these are going to be available to the public in the next few months. But we're encouraging people to take a look at these in the next few months when they come out. Elevation design guidelines from the Louisiana Preservation Office, the Resilient Heritage publication that I spoke about a few minutes ago. Report to the U.S. EPA agency on guidance documents to safely clean, decontaminate, and reoccupy flood damaged houses, and then something from the National Weather Service about being prepared for storms. That is it.
Jeff, thanks so much for that informative presentation. That was great. On behalf of the Main Street and Rural Planning Center at Commerce, the North Carolina League of Municipalities, the State Historic Preservation Office, and NCDDA, thank you for tuning in, and we wish you only success in your communities. And Jeff, thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.